was 20 for a lot of reasons. Now it's 80 plus or so in the United States. So we've extended life by 4 times. I'm not sure the body was really designed for this extended life in some cases, but you know that at some point when you hit a certain age, my mother used to say it was around 50, that things would fall apart. You know, your certain body parts aren't going to work so well, and you can't do everything you thought you could do before. So I'm in a race to get things done before the brain collapses or the body collapses. You don't know which one is going to go first.
The pandemic has obviously affected all of our lives in many ways dramatically. I remember David vividly. I've been fortunate to know David for quite some time, and I remember a number of years ago I was interviewing you on the roof of the art gallery in Aspen, Colorado. And knowing David as I did, I knew that he traveled more days a year than you can possibly imagine. You were on the road, what, 250 days a year?
Oh, 240 days a year. I was the principal fundraiser for Carlisle, so I had to raise money all over the world, so I traveled an enormous amount, yes.
And I remember asking you at the time, what would you do if you couldn't travel? And of course, in his very deadpan way, he looked at me and he says, I think I would die.
Right.
Of course,
well,
you haven't been traveling,
yet,
and you haven't died.
But actually what's happened is that people now are going to live and work differently than they have before. Think about it. The Industrial Revolution changed the way we live and work over a 70-year period of time. The personal computer over maybe a 25-year time. The smartphone over, a 5-year time. We've changed our life. Now, in just 1 year, a year and a half, we've changed the way we're going to live. People aren't probably going to go back to work 5 days a week in the office. And people aren't going to travel quite as much as they used to. So it really has changed the way we live in just a very short period of time.
Are you enjoying the change?
Well, I am able to get more things done in the Zoom period for sure, but I don't miss, I don't say that I like traveling, or I wouldn't have done it, but I also miss the interaction you have personally. When you work with people, and it's not the same on Zoom as being in them, we have lunch or dinner, and it's, the socializing is different, but I think we're coming back to where we were, but we're never going to quite go back to where we were.
This book of yours that we'll be talking about is a book of interviews. And I think of interviews as talking to people for the record. That's something you started doing when?
Well, what happened was this. I didn't grow up and say I want to be an interviewer. Nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't something I aspired to be. I thought I'd be a lawyer, a nice lawyer. My mother wanted to be a dentist. I didn't want to be a dentist, so I had to be a doctor or a lawyer, a dentist, so I had to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a doctor, and I wasn't interested in being a dentist. So I became a lawyer, but mostly because I was interested in politics. But litigators ask questions a lot and interview people. I wasn't a litigator. So what actually happened was Carlisle had these big investor conferences where we'd have lots of prominent people come, former presidents of the United States, former secretaries of state, and we were paying them a speaking fee, sometimes $250,000, sometimes even more than that. And sometimes they were boring. So I'm paying these big fees. I'm saying, well, geez, I'm not getting that much. The 1,000 people in the audience, they were falling asleep. So I would go to the speaking agent and say, look, I'd like to know if I could interview these people, maybe liven it up a little bit. And they said, well, is the speaking fee going to be the same? I said, yes. They said, okay, they don't care, as long as you're paying the fee. So I would do it, and I would make people laugh a little bit. I would make Ben Bernanke look funny, which is not easy to do. So I did that, and then what happened was Vernon Jordan called me up, said, come to see me in his office in New York. He said, he was the president of the Economic Club of Washington. Would I succeed him? And I said, I don't really want to do that. And he said, well, you're going to do it or you're not leaving this office. So I agreed to do it. And the job was to get business people to come to the Economic Club of Washington and speak, and then you ask them some questions that come in from the members. And then what happened was I found that the business people were boring speakers also. And the questions came from the members weren't very good. So I started making up questions that were humorous, asking the people, liven it up, and then ultimately I decided just to make it a full-time interview thing. And Bloomberg said they would put it on TV, and so I've been doing it for a while. And I found different ways to do it. So for example, I wanted to educate members of Congress about history. So how would I do it? I'd use my interviewing ability, and I would bring a great historian into the Library of Congress, invite only members of Congress to come for a dinner that I would host once a month, and I'd interview them about history, and American members of Congress could listen. And so it kind of came about by serendipity, but I enjoy it, and I try to do as best I can in making people interested in the interview. So for example, I just told you earlier, I interviewed today for my TV show the chairman of the SEC, a nice Baltimore Jewish boy from Baltimore. And then tomorrow I'll interview Joe Manchin for the Economic Club of Washington. Then I think next week I'm going to interview Diane von Furstenberg, who I'm not an expert in fashion, so I'm boning up on that. But
I think, for the record, David is a very good interviewer. And as someone who interviews other people myself, I like to study the style of the interviewer and the way that he or she asks questions. Do you think of yourself as having a certain style, interviewing style, David? And if you do, how are you consciously trying to develop it?
well, the style that I've used, when you have, if you know how to do something, after a while it seems natural to you. So people say they like my interviews. I'm happy to hear that. Everybody wants to be doing something other people like, but it's a style I developed. I didn't consciously set out and say I'm going to do it this way, but my style is to read everything I can about the person. If I'm interviewing a person about their book, I will read the book. Then I prepare the questions in advance, and while I'm not a journalist, I know journalists would never do this. I will give the person the questions in advance if they want them, not because I'm going to ask those questions, but make them feel good. So I give them questions, but then I do it. I memorize the questions, so I do it like I'm having a conversation, and I can remember, most of the questions. And then I always look for an opportunity to, intersperse some humor and so forth. But the trick and the way I think I've done it is not to overpower the interviewee with how smart I am, or how smart. I think an interviewer that overpowers the interviewee makes the interviewee less significant. So let the interviewee do the talking and make them feel that they have an opportunity to talk about their personality as well. So everybody likes to talk about how they overcame hardships, how they grew up, and their family things. So I always will ask people things like, did your parents live to see your success? And of course everybody wants to talk about that if their parents did live to see the success. Or, what is it like when you grew up and you didn't have any money, or things like that. So I try to intersperse human things into my interviews, and, sometimes it works.
Did your parents live long enough to see your success?
Well, my parents, my father made it to 80, he was 85, my mother at 86, and they passed away a few years ago, yeah. But they were, proud of what I had done. But interestingly, when my mother passed away, I went through all of her possessions, and the things that she kept were all the newspaper articles about gifts I had given, but nothing about my business success, because she didn't care about that so much. She didn't care about money. She only cared about philanthropy. And she told me later, when I started doing these things, I'm really proud of you doing something with your money that's useful. So, but I think my parents were, I guess, proud.
I think of you, David, as having a gift, certainly a skill, for asking disarming questions. Would you agree?
Well, I enjoy it, and when you enjoy doing something, it sometimes it shows. So I enjoy it, and the trick is, see, if you're very wealthy, it's very easy to go trying to overpower an interviewee and say, well, look what I've done, and look how important I am, and make the interviewee be diminished. The trick is, though, I approach everything like I'm the poor boy from Baltimore, and I'm happy to be a supplicant at the interviewee's knee, learning from the interviewee. So I'm not trying to ever brag about anything I've done, and most of my jokes are self-deprecating ones about myself. So I don't ever look at myself as being a wealthy, successful person. I look at myself as just like I'm, right out of college and asking questions that are ones that anybody would want to ask.
Well, I would agree that that's what you do. Do you think, though, that wealth plays a factor? In other words, do you think some of the invitations you get to interview people are because of the fact that you have some notoriety, you have some success, you've become very wealthy in the process, or that maybe some of the access that you have when you ask people to do interviews is because of that as well?
Well, most of the people I'm interviewing are people that I do know, so that makes it easier to get them to do it. Secondly, I'm not 60 Minutes. I am never trying to embarrass anybody. That's a different interview style, or I'm not trying to ever put anybody on the spot. So I think people are comfortable with the fact that I'm not going to ever embarrass them or do something that they would be not happy with. So that makes it easier. A journalist would say, well, you're not tough enough. Well, okay, I'll let journalists ask tougher questions than I ask, but I think it works out that I know the people. And also, I feel when the show is called Peer-to-Peer. And when they were coming up with the name, I didn't think I'm a peer of all the people I'm interviewing, but as I thought about it, I'm a, not just a journalist, I'm a principal in some sense. So some of these people feel like I'm having a conversation with me. I say on the name, I didn't want to put my name in it. I said, a long Jewish name is not probably going to sell. And Mike Bloomberg said, that's not a problem. So.
The subjects in your book range from Jill Lepore, the fabulous Harvard historian, to tennis great Billie Jean King, who broke so many barriers in the course of not just beating Bobby Riggs, but obviously winning, 39 Grand Slam finals, and then, of course, her subsequent career as a businesswoman and as a champion for equal rights. How did you choose whom to include and whom not to include?
Well, it's an awkward situation because I interviewed a lot of people, and then I kind of have to get it down to a manageable size. So I always answer that question by saying the publisher picked them. That way I can say, my friends, when they say, well, David, how come I'm not in the interview in your book? I say, well, I would have put you in, but the publisher didn't want you in. So, but the answer is, what I was trying to do is have a number of people who are great historians to give the story about certain things of America I wanted to talk about, and then people who've lived the American dream, and so a combination of important people and also important historians. But what I was trying to do with the book was take people through the trajectory of our country and basically say, this experiment we started with the Constitution in 1787, how has it worked out? And obviously, the Constitution is still in effect with 27 amendments, so it worked out reasonably well, but we've had struggles along the way, obviously the Civil War and other struggles we've had. And it's a story about how we've struggled for rights, women's rights, civil rights, all kinds of other things, and how we've not quite lived up to the most famous words in the English language that are in the Declaration of Independence.
I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but before I do, I have two more questions to ask. In the introduction, each interview in the book has an introduction. Now, the book itself has a longer introduction, but each interview has an introduction to help establish some context and familiarize the reader with David's subject. And in the introduction to your interview with Don Graham, you drop what I think of as something of a small bomb. David notes somewhat casually that Don Graham offered him the opportunity to buy the Washington Post back in 2013. Tell us that story.
Well, I've known Don for a long time. I live in Washington. I've always admired him. His family had owned the Washington Post since his grandfather, Eugene Meyer, had bought it a long time ago, and then Don's father had run it for quite some time, and Phil Graham. And so, and then his mother, and then Don ran it. Don asked me to have breakfast with him one morning, and Don asked me to have breakfast. I always would do it. And he said, David, I'd like you to buy the Washington Post. So, what? He said, yes, we decided to sell it, and the price is $650 million, and we think you'll be an honorable person to own it, and you're a credible person in Washington. And he told me they'd offered it to two other people before me, so I wasn't first. I think if I recall, I think offered it to Mike Bloomberg, and then they said they offered it to Eric Schmidt, and they said no. And at the time, newspapers were going this way, and I thought about it. I talked to a lot of people, and they said, David, you're going to be laying off people all the time. You're crazy. This paper, like no paper, is not just going to survive. So I went back to Don and said no, stupidly, because it turned out that there were three parts to the deal. One was you could buy, you would get the newspaper, you get the real estate in which the newspaper's owned, operated, a building, and then you would get an online company. It turned out that the online company was subsequently sold for $500 million, and the real estate was sold for about $200 million. So there's 500, that was $700 million right there. So I could have bought the newspaper for essentially nothing. But the truth is, it's much better off the way it worked out, because Jeff is much, much richer than me, and he has much better understanding of technology. So he poured an enormous amount of money and technical expertise, and the newspaper is now thriving. I think it had 400 or 500 people, journalists then. Now it's got 1,000. And so they're doing extremely well. But many things I've turned down. Facebook when Mark Zuckerberg was in college. I've turned down a lot of things I shouldn't have turned down.
By Jeff, of course, you mean Jeff Bezos, the current owner.
Yeah,
of the
Jeff
Washington
Bezos.
Post.
I also turned down at the time that he was starting his company. He didn't have any bibliography of books in print. He had to sell books over the internet, but you have to have a list of books in print. So he came to one of our companies and he offered us something like 25 or 30% of the company he was going to start in return for the bibliography. Our smart salesman said, no, we want cash. So we got $100,000 a year. After a couple of years of this, I went out and said, geez, Jeff, I think maybe we'd rather have some stock. I think you're going to be, I remember this distinctly. I went out and saw him. He was in a little ramshackle office. And basically in those days, if you ordered something from Amazon, what you did is you went to their website, you ordered it. He then went to the company that was the publisher their website. He would get it from them. He would package it up. He would take it to the post office himself. And I said, Jeff, I think you're going to take your company public, and by my back of the envelope calculations, I think you're going to be worth as almost $300 million. He said, I'll never be worth that much. So ultimately, he said, David, I don't need your as much now. I would have given you 20% of the company at the time. I'll give you effectively 1% of the company, which we did. And then at the IPO, we sold it, and it's worth a lot more today, let's say. Stupid.
Going back to what you were alluding to moments ago, I think of you as a student of constitutional history, even though that's not...
Well, I was the chief counsel for the Senate Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments at one point. That was my job when I was working for Birch Bible. We didn't pass any constitutional amendments.
There is an awful lot in this book about the founding principles that this country was built on. There's also a lot in this book about the things that were left out of those principles and the bitter struggles that so many Americans have had to wage as a result. And of course, the opposition they still face. Too many Americans today are ignorant of the history of suffrage, an incredible story that you cover to a degree in this book. And I doubt they know that not so long ago, as the book points out, one of your subjects points out, one could be arrested for being caught in a gay bar. Where do you think we are in America's constitutional journey, and where are we headed?
Well, to remember what happened, in 1787, the Constitution, that the Articles of Confederation governed the country. It wasn't working, it was very weak. They had no ability to tax anybody, so you had no money for an army, you had no ability to get anything done. So James Madison, Alexander Hamilton kind of were working on an effort to get a constitutional convention, a new way of governing the country. They persuaded George Washington, the most prominent person in the United States, to come to this and preside over it effectively. So they had this for 4 months in Philadelphia, and they did something that never been done before. They came up with, out of whole cloth, a new way to govern people, which was a representative democracy. There was the Athenian democracy a long time ago, but everybody participated there. It wasn't really representative so much. And then we had kings and queens and rulers. This was different. And so, as Benjamin Franklin famously said to somebody when he was leaving the Constitutional Convention, who asked him, "What have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" He said, "A republic if you can keep it." And the idea that something created almost 250 years ago is still around is amazing. It was an experiment not to give everybody equal rights. The slavery was allowed because they couldn't get the southern states to agree to it if they hadn't allowed slavery to continue. It wasn't for women. Women had no rights at all. In those days, women couldn't even own property in their own names if they were married. It was basically a concept that for white Christian property men, we're all going to treat them equal. And so when Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration wrote a sentence that became the most famous sentence in the English language, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What he was referring to was that all white men, more or less, he didn't say Christian, but that's probably what he had in mind, are equal. The truth is that slavery was here. He was a slave owner, and he wrote that sentence. He already owned 200. He was owning about 200 slaves then. So those words, though, were ultimately taken to be the creed of the country. When he wrote those words, they were ignored. Nobody paid attention to the preamble. But many years later, as other revolutions were going forward around the world, people said all men are created equal. And when Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, he did something that was very unusual and criticized at the time. He said, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, he was referring to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But people said, wait a second, we're not fighting this war because all men are created equal and blacks are equal to whites. We're fighting it because we want to keep the Union together. But he pulled what Gary Wills called a sleight of hand. And in the end, Lincoln kind of adopted Jefferson's rhetoric, and the rhetoric is not quite something we've actually lived up to yet, but we've made progress in living up to it. And in terms of rights and freedoms, we're getting closer to where we should be. We're not quite there. In terms of the way the organization of the government works, there's lots of flaws, and as we saw in the recent election, there are some loopholes that people could pursue, and we're very fortunate that they weren't pursued, in my view.
This is a nation of immigrants. And the book goes into some detail with at least a couple of your subjects. Right. Jillian Yang, the national editor of the New York Times, and Madeleine Albright, of course, the former ambassador to the United Nations and former Secretary of State, about immigration. Where do you think we are in this debate, and will this still be a nation of immigrants 50 years from now?
You're an immigrant.
I am indeed. I'm a Canadian.
Right. So when this country started, anybody could show up. There were no passports, there were no visas, anybody showed up. And people were showing up. They're mostly from Western Europe. And then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people were showing up who were Jewish, from Eastern Europe, who were from Asia. And some of the members of Congress and people in the federal government said, wait a second, this homogenous country we have is not going to be so homogenous anymore, because we're going to have people who are Jewish. We're going to have people from Eastern Europe. We're going to have Asians. And so in 1925, Congress finally got around to passing law that said, basically, if you're not from Western Europe, good luck in trying to get into this country. And that was the law until 1965. And in fact, as all of you probably know, during World War II, it was very difficult for Jewish immigrants to get into this country. Yes, Albert Einstein could get in, but not everybody was Albert Einstein. And so when the St. Louis was just near the city of Miami, it was turned away because the State Department said we don't have any more quotas for Jews, so it went back, and a third of the people in the St. Louis were ultimately executed in concentration camps. So President Kennedy came in, and although President Kennedy wasn't a man of the people in the sense that he rose up from modest circumstances, he was always sensitized to the fact that Boston was a place which was a melting pot. And so he was more interested in having some more immigration occur, and so he ultimately started something that Lyndon Johnson finished. In 1965, we passed the Hart-Celler Act, and basically immigration was changed in the standards, and it's led to the point where, for example, right now we have 47 million immigrants in this country. No other country in the world has as many immigrants. Now, why are people coming here? They're coming here because it's seen as a land of freedom and opportunity compared to other places, and it's a place where many immigrants believe in the American dream, whereas many people who live here and born here are not as confident that the American dream still exists. So people come here now, and they come here for all the reasons that we know. So I do think immigration is an important part of our society, and people think that it's a really good thing to have good immigration, legal immigration.
One of the beauties of talking to historians is that the issues you take up, even if they concern things that happened in the past, are often so relevant for the present. In your interview with Bu Srinivasan, who wrote a magisterial history of American capitalism, you and he are discussing the US and Chinese economic models.
Right.
And he says to you, our big mistake is leaving the bulk of our economic policy to be determined solely by the impulses of the consumer market. Consumers think on very short-term horizons. Do you agree with his assessment?
Well, the United States does not generally believe in central planning for the economy. So the Soviet Union believed in central planning, and obviously China believes in central planning. There are pluses and minuses to central planning. Our system is one where you have more freedom, but you also have greater ability to fail and be at the bottom too, and you may not have as much of a social net. So the capitalist system works pretty well for people that work hard and get lucky, but if you're at the bottom, you're not going to be so lucky, and so we do leave people behind. That's one of the flaws of capitalism. I think the Chinese system is essentially a government-controlled capitalist form. It may well be more successful in producing greater wealth than what we have here, because China has so many more people. Ultimately, China will be a wealthier country overall than we are, and it's now bigger than we are in purchase price parity. It will be probably in GDP in our lifetime, not in per capita. So I think that our system has its flaws that we see every day, and COVID has exacerbated them. It's made it even worse for people who can't read, who don't have jobs, who don't have child care, don't have broadband. Those people have fallen further and further behind.
One of the things people worry about, certainly wonder about if they're thinking about their own economic future, if they're making policy, if they're running a business, is whether this country's system of capitalism, which you just described, is ready to meet the economic challenge that China poses. What do you think?
Well, it depends on what we mean as the challenge. In other words, I don't think we can move as quickly to get certain things done. Take infrastructure. We've been debating infrastructure for how many years? And the infrastructure is crumbling everywhere, and we're still debating it. If China wants to build a bridge or something, it tends to get done pretty quickly. And one of Tom Friedman's books, he points out that he went to the metro in Washington, the subway in Washington, and it wasn't working. He had to walk down the steps to get down there. And then he went to China that day, and there he sees a vacant lot. And then he comes back 6 months later, and the vacant lot already has been filled with a big building. But he goes back to the same place where the metro steps are not working, and 6 months later, they hadn't been fixed. So we don't fix things quite as well in this country. But in the end, I think we don't want to sacrifice our liberties and freedoms as much as I think the Chinese government would have us do. But our system works well for people that are self-starters, well-educated, want to achieve something. But if you're born with one parent or no parents essentially raising you, if you are not literate, and we have 14% of our population is completely illiterate, or essentially in this country, if you are a drug addict or you have other kind of health problems and you don't have means to get them fixed, you're going to be left behind in this country. So it's a great system for people who are able to take advantage of the system, but people who are not able to are going to fall behind and are falling further and further behind.
There's a great section in the book on technology and innovation, but the truth of the matter is that those topics are themes that run throughout the book in one way, shape, or form. And I mentioned Jill Lepore as one of your subjects, and she notes astutely how much technology has changed the way we communicate with one another, and thus it has changed the nation's politics.
So I should say Jill Lepore, who some of you may not know her, she writes for the New Yorker if you read the New Yorker, but she also is a professor of history at Harvard. And this book that I interviewed her about called These Truths, which is about, it's a one-volume encyclopedic history of the United States. Amazingly, the first encyclopedic history of the United States ever written by a woman. And she talks a lot about women's rights and things and women's struggles in this book, which you didn't read in the textbooks that I was reading when I was in high school and college. And one interesting anecdote, she points out in the interview that she's trying to focus more on women's rights and things like that. But she went into a classroom, I think, of third graders or something, and asked them about the Revolutionary War heroes, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. And then she said, well, what about the women in those days? She asked the young students. And the young girl said, well, they didn't have women in those days. Because you never read about them, and so these little girls didn't think there were women then.
So if we think of that as a nexus, the nexus of technology, of communications, and of politics, it's fair to say that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg are right at that nexus as we speak.
Look, when Mark Zuckerberg was in college, my now son-in-law was his classmate and has been his classmate at Phillips Exeter, and he told me about this company, and I said, this is a dating service, right? Yes. I've seen dating services before. They all kind of fall apart. So I had a chance to look at whether I wanted to invest, and I turned it down. Obviously, Mark has, if you believe the numbers, is like 2.5 billion people who are using Facebook. I'm not on Facebook because I resent the fact that I turned down the investment. So I've never been on Facebook, but a lot of people seem to use it. I assume most people probably have a Facebook account, but I don't.
This country is spending time at the moment, both citizens and, of course, their elected representatives, thinking about Facebook's role in the national discourse, the degree to which it is or isn't promoting polarization and extremism, and of course, right now, its role in the January 6th insurrection. How have you been thinking about these things?
Well, January 6th, I assume everybody remembers where they were when President Kennedy was assassinated. Is there anybody here who doesn't remember where they were? And everybody remembers where they were when 9/11 happened, right? And I think the same is with January 6th. I was in my kitchen, getting ready for another Zoom call, and then I saw this. I was transfixed as everybody was. How can this happen in our country? And I thought, oh, maybe in a banana republic it would happen. And of course, in a banana republic, the military would show up with the tanks and they would take over the government. And I didn't know what was going to happen here. We now know that it was much more complicated and there was a lot of work done to plan it. But it is amazing how many people around the world would call me and call it you and say, how could this happen in your country? It was astounding to people that this could happen. And now we escaped January the 6th in many ways because many people complied with the law. 65 lawsuits were filed and 65 lawsuits were thrown out of court and dismissed. But suppose they hadn't been dismissed. And suppose, take Vice President Pence. Under our system, the way the Constitution works, the Vice President is supposed to read and the ballots as they come in. But let's suppose he said, I'm not going to do it, I don't want to deal with it. Well, they could have had somebody else perhaps read it, but maybe it had gone, the Senate couldn't reach an agreement, it would have gone to the House. Under our Constitution, the way the presidential elections work, it's by state delegation. So there are more Democrats in the House than Republicans, but there are more Republican delegations, Republicans in majority. So if they'd gone to the House, then we would have had a different election. So election outcome, and it's gone to the House a couple times. So it's hard to believe that it happened, but you know, there are some people, as the Republicans polling data shows, I think something like 60 or 70% of Republicans do believe the election was stolen.
In your interview with the historian Douglas Brinkley about the race to the moon, you discuss the superhuman and improbably successful effort to put man on the moon before the end of the 1960s. And when talking to Francis Collins of the National Institutes of Health, you discussed the Human Genome Project. And both of those efforts were largely federally funded projects. There was a parallel private effort to decode the human genome, and it was successful, but the NIH effort was a federal project, and of course, NASA was federally funded. Today, David, it seems the government is out of the business of solving the country's biggest problems. People like Elon Musk are doing that for us. Is that a good thing?
Well, President Kennedy wanted to go to the moon, and there was no other thought that anybody other than government could do it at the time. And the effort to map the human genome was originally a government project, then somebody who was part of that then spun away and tried to do it in the private sector. Today, I don't think there's a terrible thing about private sector doing some of these things. I do think we make sure we have certain things that are American priorities operating the right way, but I'm not against it, and the government is still involved a bit, but it is amazing that you think about how we never believed that the people could go to the outer space on a private sector venture alone, but now it seems to be the case. Yes.
Yes, meaning?
Yes, it's going to happen, and I think more things are going to happen. It's a very entrepreneurial kind of effort, and it shows you that you can really, quote, reach for the stars by, if you dream about something, as Elon Musk has dreamed about this, and what he's put together in these two companies is amazing when you think about it. He's put these two companies together in a relatively short period of time, and he's now running both of them, and both of them are now having extraordinary valuations. I think today Tesla hit $1 trillion, and some people think that SpaceX will be worth more.
It's true. Washington has a never-ending capacity to confound and confuse us, and what's confounding and confusing to many Democrats is the resistance put up by two senators, Senators Sinema and Manchin, whom you'll be speaking with tomorrow, to President Biden's spending plans. And I should also mention the threat that progressive Democrats have made in the House not to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which you mentioned earlier. Is this evidence in your mind of democracy functioning well, or evidence of a broken system that doesn't respect the wishes and wants of Americans?
Well, it's both. The system isn't working that well. When I worked in Congress, not because I was there, but in the late 70s, Congress worked better in the sense that Republicans and Democrats thought that they should work together to get bipartisan legislation, and you needed to. Today, ever since President Obama, there's a general view it's either all Democratic or all Republican. There's some exceptions. The infrastructure bill is an exception. But as a general matter, people feel that if you're working with the other side, you're going to be criticized, and therefore you won't be able to raise campaign funds, and campaign funds are the mother's milk of politics. And members of Congress feel compelled to raise money, not because they use it themselves particularly. They're paid very low salaries, relatively speaking. It hasn't had a salary increase in 20 years, and 85 members have to live in their House offices because they can't afford an apartment in New York, in Washington. But members of Congress have to raise money because whoever spends the most money usually wins, not always. Secondly, if you have a lot of money, you can scare somebody to not run against you. Third, you can use it to kind of give other members who might want to vote for you for committee chairmanships or something. And fourth, when you leave the government, you can keep the money. I mean, you can't use it personally, but you can use it for all kinds of political expenses, and it's very vague as to what you can not do with it. So members are always raising money. They're not talking to each other anymore. They don't see each other. They don't know each other very much anymore. So it's a different situation than it used to be, and I think that democracy isn't working as well as I wish it would. And I think nobody in this Washington really is that happy with the system, but we've now reached a system where people are afraid that somebody on social media will see them meeting with somebody in the opposite party or talking with somebody in the opposite party or voting for something that isn't, the party line. So it's not a good situation. We've had worse. The Civil War was worse. Members of Congress were fighting with each other on the floor from time to time. But it's not good.
Would it help if we had a third party?
I don't think so, only because when you have third parties, you create a lot of instability, I think. And so I'm not sure it works in our country. We've never really had effective third parties, though sometimes elections have been changed because of third parties. You could argue that the Green Party in 2000 may have had a big impact on Al Gore not getting elected. But I would think we're probably going to have the two-party system for quite some time. And I think, though, in the next presidential election, it's very interesting if some people who are Republicans or against Trump, if they were to start an independent Republican kind of party, they might sweep some votes away from Trump if Trump were to win. So it's unclear how it would work if that were to happen.
Apropos of that point you just made, in your book you asked presidential historian Michael Beschloss if he was surprised that Congress voted to impeach President Trump after the January 6th insurrection. And he said no, he wasn't surprised, but what did surprise him was how few Republicans voted to impeach. And since then, of course, the GOP has hardened its position and effectively disowns anyone in its ranks who questions or challenges President Trump. Does that surprise you?
Well, it surprises in this sense. When you talk to Republican members of Congress, with very few exceptions, they know what's going on, but they're afraid that Trump is so popular in their district that they will be primaried if they run against him in some way. So I think they wish that this wasn't the case. And I don't know, I haven't met any Republican members of Congress who say, I really hope that President Trump runs again, privately. Publicly, they might say that, but privately they don't. But they don't know how to get rid of the situation. The Republican Party is now really controlled at the organization level and large parts of the voting base by President Trump. And I went on TV right after the presidential election. I was on, I think it was Squawk Box, and I said, I think he's going to run again. This is the day after the election. And I think Becky Quick was interviewing me, and they were like, are you kidding? He just lost. But I think he's pretty interested in running again. And look, being president of the United States is an intoxicating thing. A lot of people like that job. And, if you had it once and you think you can get it again, why not? So I think he thinks he has a chance. And I think it's not wrong. It's not impossible to think that he would run again, and it's not impossible to think he could win.
This is my last question for you before I turn to questions we have from the audience. We aren't yet at the point where we can definitively document the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a little too early to write its history, and it may be years before we can. But if you could conduct the kind of interview about the pandemic that you do about other topics in this book, with whom would it be?
Well, Tony Fauci is the most knowledgeable person about infectious diseases in the world. There's nobody is in second. He has been heavily criticized by people that don't like some of the things he says, but to me, he's the most knowledgeable person. I would say Francis Collins, the head of NIH, is probably very knowledgeable too, a terrific person, a real Renaissance man. But those people, I think, know the most about it, and I'm not sure we're out of the woods because of the reasons we all know, but there's the pandemic another pandemic could come back. What this is likely to be a virus that escaped from an animal and jumped to a human species. And these are called zoonotic diseases. And we're likely to have more of them because the humans are increasingly, as we expand the population of the world, we're encroaching on lands that animals are occupying, and increasingly, we're interacting with them. And when you have wet markets and things like that, it's likely this could happen again. And I'm not sure we're better protected or better prepared than we were last time. The amazing thing about this is that we got a vaccine. Normally, it takes 7 years or so to produce a vaccine. The polio vaccine took 7 years. The fastest any vaccine ever previously been produced was 4 for, I think, the mumps vaccine. Now, we produce this in 11 months. Had we not produced a vaccine, we would have multiples of the number of people who've died or dying. And we're very fortunate. Remember, the great Spanish flu of 1918, where maybe 35 million Americans, or 35 million people around the world, or maybe more, lost their lives. We don't know exactly. There was no vaccine, and there is still no vaccine for that particular virus.
Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations. I love these questions. Can't wait to ask them of David.
So let me ask you a question. Where'd you get those striped socks? Those are very, very nice.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, they're nice. It's very appealing. I should get some.
I can take care of that. David, how do you feel about judging historical figures in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, or even more recently by today's standards?
Well, 8 of our first 11 presidents were slave owners. And while they recognized that slavery was morally indefensible, I think they just didn't want to challenge the system, and they lived with the system, and they obviously benefited from it. So I think some things, it's unfair to go back to somebody and say, well, let's look at somebody 1,000 years ago. He or she didn't believe that women should have the right to vote, or even 100 years ago, or 200 years ago. You have to look at things in the context. But I think, for example, some people say we shouldn't have a Washington monument, we shouldn't honor Thomas Jefferson, we shouldn't honor people that were slave owners because they were slave owners, even though they may have done good things. So I think you have to look at these things with a kind of more discretion. I don't think just because somebody's a slave owner, we should banish them from all history. On the other hand, if the principal thing that they are famous for is being a slave owner, or if you're having a monument to Robert E. Lee, principally because you want to assert white rights, white supremacy, that's a different thing. So I think you have to look at it with some care. It's not an easy issue, but I don't think you have to look at the good and the bad and explain the good and bad to people so that people, when they look at history, they can see what happened, why we honor people, and why we don't think some people are good. The point of history is to learn from it. That's the whole point of history, is to learn the mistakes were made and then benefit from it. So I don't think we should whitewash completely what happened. But on the other hand, I don't think we should wipe away great people who made some mistakes, like being slave owners.
To those of you who see me shuffling these cards, I'm not rank ordering them. I'm just trying to organize them in such a way that conversation proceeds in a logical fashion. David, are there any politicians today who deserve to be in profiles of courage? Who and why?
Well, to be honest, when John Kennedy was writing that book, he struggled with finding members of Congress to put in there. They weren't sure how many they could have. Today, it would be a thinner book than maybe it was even then. Because right now, it's an interesting phenomenon. The job of being a member of the Congress, Senate or House, pays nothing, virtually, $180,000 a year, not enough to support a family of 4 in the style they have to have. Why are people so obsessed with a job? I guess they like the power that you get, but they're deathly afraid they're going to lose an election. As a result, you don't see a lot of profiles in courage. I wish that they would, do things somewhat differently, but it's not going to change for a while. And so there are a few profiles in courage you see from time to time. I would say right now, Liz Cheney is a bit of a profile in courage. I don't see a lot of political benefit to what she's doing, but she seems to be willing to stake out a position that's obviously not making her popular in her constituency or with her fellow members of the Republican Party.
You've given plenty of thought to our political system, its strengths and weaknesses. If you could change one thing, what would it be to make it work better?
I would have more private equity people running for president. I think that's the thing we need. No, to change one thing, I would take money out of politics. Right now, under our Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, anybody can spend any amount of money they want. It's free speech, and there are no effective limits on spending. If you could do what they do in other countries, where the spending is really constrained and the election campaigns are shorter, I would be much better. So I was talking one time, I was interviewing the Prime Minister of Singapore, and I congratulated him on his just getting elected again. I said, how long was your campaign? He said 4 days. It was a 4-day campaign. Even in Britain, I think the elections for Prime Minister maybe 2 or 3 weeks. But the amount of money is so staggering here that we don't call it corruption or legalized bribery because we're Americans and we think the banana republics have that. But the truth is, when you give staggering sums to members of Congress or governors or other elected officials, you generally expect something in return, not always. And so we could get rid of money in politics and shorten the campaigns. That would be what I would do.
Do you make political donations?
I don't make any. I don't ever make a political donation because I think in the old days, if you gave $1,000 the maximum, I guess you could say you're not bribing anybody. $1,000 is probably not enough to bribe somebody. But now there's unlimited amounts. And so if somebody like me is going to give $1 million or $2 million or $5 million to somebody, what should people think when they read that I gave $5 million campaign? Did I just happen to like the person? I think they're going to think other things. So I don't really want people to think I'm trying to bribe somebody or do anything. So I don't give political donations. And the good news is I don't get asked for them anymore either. So,
What would it take for people like you to run for president or another high office?
well, right now, we've always had cases where people had their personal reputations destroyed. I mean, Thomas Jefferson had people saying he was having an affair with a dusky woman. It turned out to be true. Sally Hemings. People always criticize people, but I think right now you have to have a very thick skin, and you have to think that you're really going to be able to do something more impressive than what you're doing in the private sector. Right now, in the private sector through philanthropy, you can get a fair amount done, but also my problem is also I'm too young. I'm 72 years old, and you got to be older to run for president. I think President Biden is 78, and if Donald Trump runs, he'd be 78. So I'm too young. I need more experience.
How damaging was former President Trump to the American experiment?
It wasn't a plus, I would say. Generally, I've interviewed President Trump. I think I told you this, right, or not? So what happened was I didn't really know President Trump or Donald Trump that well, but my parents, when they retired, they're blue-collar people, and they could retire the day that they were eligible to retire. So they could retire from the post office at 55. So my father moved with my mother to a suburb of Baltimore called West Palm Beach, Florida. And when they moved down there, when I would have family events, I would do it at Mar-a-Lago because it was a nice food and so forth. And you didn't have to be a member, so I just show up with a credit card. We have family events, and Donald Trump would often show up and kind of get his picture taken with us. And we didn't ask him to have a picture, but we get his picture taken with us. And it was very friendly to me. And then one time I was at the Economic Club of Washington. I was trying to get somebody to interview, and somebody said Donald Trump. I didn't really know him that well, but I wrote him a letter, and he said right away he would come down. And he came down, and he said, David, ask me anything you want, but ask me 2 questions for sure. One, ask me if I'm going to run for president. I said, President of what? He said, President of the United States. I said, geez, you're not having no chance. You're a real estate developer. He says, I know, but it'll help my brand and do it for a while. Secondly, ask me if my hair is real and pull my hair because, people think it's fake. I said, I don't feel I'm comfortable doing that, but I will, ask you about your hair. So anyway, afterwards, he said it was a great interview. He called me and said, I'm going to make you an honorary member of Mar-a-Lago, and it was the highest rated show in the history of C-SPAN. So I called the president of C-SPAN and said, what were the ratings? He said, we don't have ratings. So I realized he might exaggerate from time to time. I don't know. Maybe we was the highest rated show. I don't know. But I think Donald Trump, I don't think was a plus for democracy in some ways. I did talk to him when he was president a couple times for things that I needed to do as the president of the chairman of the Kennedy Center and some other things. I did see him. But I would say, I think in the end, democracy, was probably not advanced by some of the things we've now read about and know about.
Since you brought up Palm Beach, I'm going to insert, forgive me, a question of my own. There's something of a level of anxiety in this town, a building level of anxiety about the number of wealthy New Yorkers, most of them from the financial services industry, who are decamping for Florida. Many of them to Miami, a number to Palm Beach as well. Why are they leaving?
Well, I think during COVID, people realized you can be anywhere. So some people wanted to be in warmer climes. Secondly, there's no state income tax in Florida, and there's no estate tax in Florida either. So you see a lot of people that I know, I won't mention names, who are, all of a sudden at 86 years old, they're moving from California to Florida. Why? I think there's no estate tax there. I don't think it's a terrible thing to do necessarily. I don't own a home in Florida. I've looked for whiles, and I haven't bought anything, and I think that's going to say on my tombstone, he's still looking for a home in Florida. I've never bought one, but I think that's why people have done it. I also think that New York is probably seen by many people who live here as a high tax place and so forth. So I have not tried to live my life by tax considerations, so I don't contort my life. So I'm not a Florida resident, and I pay my share of taxes, maybe more than my share, I don't really know, but I pay a fair amount of taxes, but okay, that's life.
Tell us your views, David, on the potential expansion of the U.S. Supreme Court and on term limits for justices.
And the second part was?
Term limits for justices.
Okay. The Supreme Court is not going to be expanded. The commission that the president appointed it wasn't given the mandate to come up with an expansion plan. It was asked to consider many things. They will not recommend, I'm 100% certain, an expansion, because nobody in Washington who thinks about it is in favor of it, because you realize that it can backfire against you. And, so we've had, it's not in the Constitution, you have 9, but it's legislation. We've had fewer at times than 9. I would say term limits, I think, generally have some benefit, but the Supreme Court, while it has some challenges, the fact that people are there for life gives them such an independence and credibility that I probably think that is not a wise thing to change. Over the years, we've tried to incent judges to step back at the age of 70, which still seems young to me, but they step back so they can become senior status, same pay, but a lower workload. I don't think in the end we'll have term limits. And remember, term limits would require a constitutional amendment, because judges are supposed to be appointed for life under the Constitution. So to get a constitutional amendment there's only 2 ways. You can have a new constitutional convention, which we've never had, or you get 2/3 of each house and 3/4 of each state. And it's almost impossible to do. We've had 27 amendments, 17 if you don't count the Bill of Rights, and it's hard to get done, and it's just too difficult. So I think it's better to expend energy on other things.
Do you think we'll see the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico become states?
I think the District of Columbia is seen as a Democratic organization. I think the vote was like 95 or 96% for the Democrat and 4% for Trump, something like that. And it's a widely seen Democratic city, and therefore the Republicans are not going to allow the D.C. to have Senate votes, basically, or be a true state, but for that reason. Now, there was a plan years ago to give Utah more electoral votes that compensate for D.C., but it's not going to happen in my view. Now, there's a view that you can do it by statute as opposed to constitutional amendments. Makes it easier, but I don't see it happening anytime soon because the Republicans will block it.
Why do many Americans not realize the true meaning of Veterans Day and Memorial Day? It seems that they have become sales days.
Well, I haven't been asked that question before, but there's no doubt that holidays are used to sell more products, I guess. So Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Labor Day, some people take the days off. I don't know how many people on Memorial Day actually go to visit cemeteries of veterans or things like that. I do think it's becomes a bit commercial, but I'm not the expert on that.
What suggestions or thoughts would you offer on restoring? I think I'm reading it wrong, but restoring will work. A sense of civic pride and national confidence among young Americans.
Well, right now, young Americans are not required to take civics courses generally and American history courses, so we know relatively little. And as a result, they don't have great pride in our history. They don't know much about our history. Recently, a survey was done of Americans about what they knew about American history and civics, the citizenship test you have to take if you're a naturalized American. And in 49 out of 50 states, a majority of citizens failed this test, native-born Americans. 91% of people who take the test who are naturalized citizens to be pass it. But they know more than sometimes the native-born Americans. I think what we have to do is give people more education about it and give them a greater sense of the potential of the American dream and why people should believe in it. And I believe in it. Obviously, a lot of people don't believe in it anymore.
What role has Judaism played in your life, and what are your feelings about Israel?
Well, my ancestors came over from Ukraine to escape pogrom. So I like to say when they got the United States, they said, well, our name is Rockefeller, but we want to make sure people know we're Jewish, so change the name from Rockefeller to Rubenstein. But that's not true. Look, if you look like I do and your name is Rubenstein, people know you're Jewish. And so how has it affected me? I mean, I'm proud to be Jewish. 0.2% of the population and 20% of the Nobel Prizes, a very impressive group of people for lots of reasons. But I don't know what kind of discrimination I face because people don't come up to you and usually say, because you're Jewish, I'm not going to do this with you or do that with you. You don't know. But I would say, I'm proud to be Jewish. I don't think my rabbi thought I was that great at it because when I went to Hebrew school for 6 or 7 years to get ready for my bar mitzvah, and then the rabbi went to my mother and said, he's a nice young boy, but I'm going to write it out for him phonetically in English because I'm not sure he can get through it if he has to read the Hebrew. Well, it was a little disappointing after all those years of Hebrew school, but okay, I got through it and survived the bar mitzvah. Israel is something all people who are Jewish should be proud of. I think it's a desert land that people who are Jewish made into a thriving country. I would say the government could work a little bit better than it does from time to time. You'd think very smart people who are Jews could come up with a better system to run the country than they have. It's like 25 different parties, it seems. But I mean, obviously it takes great pride in it. I invest in the country. I believe in the country. I think it's obviously got some challenges. I think the Abraham Accords are a step in the right direction. We could use some more support from some other countries in the Arab world. But I think it's a country that has been a miracle in terms of what you look at what it was in 1948 compared to what it is today.
Which of the interviews in the book did you find the most surprising?
Most surprising? Well, I interviewed Cal Ripken from Baltimore, my hometown of Baltimore, and
Baseball player.
Great baseball player, and I found I didn't really know him, but he's very modest and unassuming. And I did more research. I realized here's an American hero. He didn't take any steroids. He didn't take any drugs. No scandals. I mean, just an incredible icon. And but I wouldn't say surprising, but I was really pleased with it. But I interviewed Justice Sotomayor, and she wanted to talk about civic engagement, how we need to make sure people know more about civics, and that was the main focus that she wanted to talk about. There are a lot of surprising things. I think I was surprised that Rita Moreno was willing to talk about her 8 or 9 year affair with Marlon Brando, and she talked about the fact that she tried to commit suicide because he was unfaithful, and barely did she survive. Sometimes you don't get people wanting to talk about those kind of things, but on the whole, what I've tried to do is put together a book that I can learn a little bit more about America, and each chapter kind of stands on its own, and then the audio version of it has the original interviews. It's not a reader just reading it. It's the original interviews with the people I interviewed, and I think people that I talk to like it.
My favorite part of the Rita Moreno interview is when she goes out with Elvis Presley and Marlon Brando finds out, throws a fit, breaks a lot of furniture.
Well, but she later said, I don't know if it was in the interview, that Elvis Presley wasn't so good at delivering the goods. But anyway.
What gift are you most proud of having given?
Well, I'm most proud of anything that my mother was happy with. So my mother, when she would call me and say that's a good gift, that's you pleasing your Jewish mother is always a good thing. But I guess probably the things that people will remember the most is either fixing the Washington Monument, which, in the grand scheme of things was a modest contribution financially, but it seems that it's amazing how many people talk about that, even though, it wasn't financially the biggest thing I've done, or when I bought the Magna Carta and effectively gave it to U.S., that was, some things. But I'm pleased that I was able to do things that help give back things to the country, and I've called it Patriotic Philanthropy, trying to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. So it's something I've picked out as something I kind of spend a reasonable amount of time on.
What would you like to do in life that you haven't done yet?
Well, I was not a great athlete, so I'd be happy to, if I could actually do something athletic, that would be good. I'd be good. The good thing about not being a good athlete is that I have all my I have all my regular body parts. I don't have any artificial body parts. All my friends were All-American athletes. They broke all their body parts, and so now they hobble around. I don't have that problem. But I guess I would like to do something that, where people say, well, he's done something useful for the country, so there are other things I could do, and I continue to do it. And I just hope, you have good health, you can keep doing it. We all are prisoners of the body that we have, and nobody knows when your time is up. So friends of mine come down with some types of cancers or other things they can't control, and they leave Earth prematurely. Colin Powell was a friend of mine. I was with him at the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I asked him to speak at the Kennedy Center, and in the green room I was with him, and he seemed okay. He had some health problems, but he seemed okay. And then a couple weeks later, gone. It's just so hard. I was just talking to him. It's just so hard. So I tell people, live your life to the fullest. Try to find something that'll make you happy. Happiness is the most elusive thing in life. Find something that makes you happy and pursue it without hurting other people. And then try to live your life to the fullest, because, you don't know when your time is going to be up.
I'll conclude, David, with a question of my own. You mentioned earlier that you're 72. You've seen quite a lot happen in this country, more than I have.
Right.
How optimistic are you for the future of the United States of America, and how does that optimism compare, let's say, with the degrees of optimism that you've felt over the course of your life?
Well, I'm reasonably optimistic. People that accomplish things in life generally going to be optimists. Usually people who are terrible pessimists probably don't get things done because they just not optimistic, they didn't get things done, so they kind of mope around a lot. So if you've achieved things, you're probably an optimist by nature. The United States has lots of challenges, and the income inequality is one of them. Racial prejudice is another. Anti-Semitism is another, and that's rising. But generally, I wouldn't want to live in any other country. I think we have the elements to make the country as good as we'd like it to be, but we just need to pull the country together. Right now, we're split down the middle. Congress seems unwilling to do anything. The country is split down the middle, and it's a sad situation. But I'm reasonably optimistic. I just think we need some profiles and courage, and some people willing to say, I don't need to get reelected, and I'm going to do what's right for the country, and I don't care about the consequences. We need more of those kind of people.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David Rubenstein.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, thank you. Thank you all for coming.
David, we overlapped at the University of Chicago. I was undergraduate with Phil Curlin in the law school. And I just did an interview for the University of Chicago and the Illinois Holocaust Museum that I co-founded on January 6th insurrection.